When a narcissist sees you again after a long period of silence, their first reaction does not come from memory, nor from emotional attachment, but from the survival nervous system. On a biological level, your silence has cut off the external regulation they once relied on to stabilize their ego, forcing the reptilian brain and the limbic system to process the loss of control on their own. In the moment of recognizing you, the amygdala does not read you as someone from the past, but as a dangerous variable, because you are no longer emitting the familiar signals of reaction, explanation, or attempts at reconciliation. This activates a defensive reflex sequence in which the goal is not connection, but the re-establishment of power and a false sense of safety. As higher regulatory circuits weaken, more primitive mechanisms take over. And at this point, what psychology calls the ego no longer operates through consciousness, but through reflex. That is why the behavior they display immediately afterward is often impulsive, sometimes very subtle, sometimes very crude, but always revolves around a single question posed by the nervous system. Do you still react? If you react, whether with anger, hurt, or even controlled composure, their brain registers that the threat has been partially neutralized because emotional control has returned to their hands. But if you do not react, if you stand there with calm that does not need to prove, defend, or explain, then what they are forced to face is no longer you, but the void within themselves. This void is not romantic, it is existential, because for the first time, their nervous system must confront the absence of an external regulator to help manage emotion. And it is precisely this moment that creates the deepest instability. This video is not created to retell an old story, nor to analyze what they did to you, but to clarify something far more important. When you remain silent long enough and no longer react, you do not merely leave a relationship. You withdraw yourself from the entire neurological mechanism that once allowed them to exist through power over others. In the first 5 seconds, when a narcissist sees you after a long period of silence, the reaction does not occur at the level of conscious thought, but in subcortical regions. The amygdala is the first area to activate. It does not analyze the past story, does not recall memories, and does not care about right or wrong. It does only one thing: assess the threat to control. Your presence in a calm state, without scanning, without seeking feedback, without expressing a need for connection, creates an unfamiliar signal for their limbic system. The amygdala reads this signal as a form of unpredictability, and to the survival brain, unpredictability is always categorized alongside danger. Therefore, the first reflex is not to miss you, but to rapidly scan whether you are still within their sphere of control. Immediately afterward, the prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for conscious thought, regulation of social behavior, and planning, temporarily loses executive control. This point is crucial. When the amygdala is strongly activated, stress signals reduce the regulatory capacity of the prefrontal cortex. In other words, they have not yet had time to think. They are only reacting. This is why, in the first seconds, their gaze, posture, or a spontaneous remark often reveals more than they intend. This is not a character slip, but a brief loss of neural control. At the same time, the reward circuitry, especially dopamine-related pathways, begins to engage. Previously, their brain learned one thing very clearly: your emotional reactions equal reward. Arguments, explanations, hurt, anger, even defensive silence all once delivered dopamine because they confirmed that they still had an effect on you. When you stand before them without emitting those familiar signals, the reward circuitry enters a state of prediction error. The brain expects a reward but does not receive it. This moment is intensely uncomfortable at a biological level, not an emotional one. The brain hates incorrect predictions. As a result, the next reflex in those first 5 seconds is often a rapid probing behavior, a provocative glance, a deliberately casual remark, a display of status, or an ambiguous signal just sufficient to test whether dopamine will return. If this probing behavior fails to elicit a reaction from you, the neural loop moves into a higher tension state. The amygdala continues to hold executive control. The prefrontal cortex has not yet stepped in to perform appropriately, and the reward circuitry begins pushing the system to do something stronger, to restore a sense of control. At the level of depth psychology, exactly as Carl Jung described, this is the moment when the persona no longer has enough energy to shield, forcing the shadow to surface. But at the biological level, it is simply this. The survival brain is trying to terminate the feeling of helplessness. Therefore, the narcissist's first reflex in those initial 5 seconds is not love, not longing, not regret, but a sequence of neural reactions aimed at answering a single question. Do I still have control? If the answer is no, the entire system behind it will begin escalating behavior in the minutes, hours, or days that follow. And here is what you need to understand clearly. Your calm is not merely a psychological attitude, it is a biological signal that causes their system to lose its anchor. When probing behaviors in those first seconds fail to produce a reaction from you, the narcissist's nervous system moves into a second phase, escalation to terminate helplessness. At this point, the amygdala still holds executive control because the brain has not received any signal of safety, while the reward circuitry continues to signal deprivation due to the absence of expected dopamine. The combination of unresolved threat and denied reward creates a biological pressure that forces the system to act more forcefully, not because of emotional outburst, but because the brain cannot tolerate a state of no control. End quote. At this stage, the prefrontal cortex begins to regain partial control, but not to regulate in a healthy way, rather to design behavior with a clearer objective, how to force you to react. This is why, after the initial encounter, you often see them appear more composed, their words more calculated, their gaze less exposed, while the underlying motive remains unchanged. Their brain is attempting to restore the familiar loop: stimulation, reaction, reward. If earlier it was a glance or a casual remark, at this stage it may become more socially sophisticated behavior, such as exaggerated displays of success or happiness, feigned kindness, or conversely, planting a mildly disturbing signal sufficient to activate your limbic system. What is important to understand is that at the neural level, this is not a moral or emotional choice, but an attempt to regulate physiological state. When dopamine does not return, the system will continue to increase stimulus intensity, much like a reward-dependent brain must increase dosage when the old dose no longer works. From Carl Jung's perspective, this is the moment when the persona begins to perform deliberately to shield a threatened shadow. But framed neurologically, it is simply the coordination between the prefrontal cortex and reward circuits to re-establish a lost sense of power. If you still do not react at this stage, their brain has no option but to maintain a high-tension state, leading to further escalatory behaviors, not because they want to harm, but because their nervous system lacks any mechanism for self-regulation when there is no longer another person serving as an anchor. When all initial escalation efforts fail, when you do not respond to probing glances, do not waver before feigned kindness, and are not triggered by displays or provocations, the narcissist's nervous system enters a more dangerous, yet more predictable phase: defensive restructuring. At this point, the question is no longer, how do I make you react? But how do I avoid feeling the helplessness unfolding inside me? This is a critical transition, because the human brain, especially the survival brain, cannot tolerate prolonged loss of control. When it cannot restore the dopamine loop through direct interaction with you, the nervous system is forced to find another outlet to reduce internal stress, and that outlet usually turns inward toward rewriting reality. At the neural level, this occurs when the prefrontal cortex regains relative executive control, not to regulate emotions healthily, but to rationalize the threat that the amygdala continues to sustain. The brain needs a new story, a new cognitive structure to transform "I am not in control" into "I am right and the other person is wrong." It is here that behaviors such as smear campaigns, role reversal between victim and perpetrator, calculated avoidance, or abrupt cutoff begin to appear. This is not random cruelty, but a strategy of psychological survival. If they cannot pull you back into the reaction loop, they must remove you from their internal frame of reference, because your presence in calm, non-participatory form continually triggers biological level failure signals. According to Carl Jung, when the persona no longer has enough energy to maintain the desired image, the ego is forced to use the shadow as a defensive tool. The shadow here is not merely a bad side in moral terms, but a collection of primitive impulses aimed at protecting the ego from disintegration. However, setting Jung aside and looking more strictly through a scientific lens, we see a similar mechanism described in the work of Heinz Kohut, founder of self-psychology. Kohut argued that individuals with severe narcissistic structures fail to develop the capacity for internal emotional self-regulation and instead rely on self-objects, other people, to maintain a sense of cohesion. When this self-object withdraws, does not react, and does not affirm, the psychological system enters what Kohut called fragmentation anxiety, a form of non-conscious but extremely intense disintegration anxiety. In that state, the brain does not seek truth or healing, but any cognitive structure strong enough to prevent collapse. This is why, at this stage, you often observe a clear shift in how they speak about you. You are no longer the idealized figure, nor the object to be conquered, but become the problematic one, the cold one, the ungrateful one, or even the narcissist. This mechanism is not fully conscious deception, but a neural attempt to reduce internal conflict. If they were to acknowledge that you withdrew because you saw the truth, their nervous system would have to face shame at an intolerable level. But if they reconstruct the story so that you become the source of harm, the brain can temporarily exit the alarm state. In other words, smearing is not only a social behavior, it is a biological regulation tool. Another perspective, complementing Jung and Kohut, comes from Stephen Porges' polyvagal theory. Porges explains that when the nervous system cannot return to safety through social engagement, it descends into lower defensive states, such as fight, flight, or freeze. In the narcissist's case, when you no longer participate in emotional interaction, the social engagement system fails, and the brain shifts toward control-based or avoidant defensive strategies. Smearing, cutting off, or rapidly attaching to another person are not signs of forgetting you quickly, but indications that their nervous system cannot tolerate prolonged emptiness. They need a new stimulus, a new structure, to pull the nervous system out of the danger zone. The important point here, and also where many people misunderstand, is that this process does not unfold in silence or serenity for them. Even if, on the outside, it looks as though they are fine, moving on, or winning, inside there is a prolonged state of tension, because the brain must continuously maintain a new story in order to avoid touching the truth. Your calm, if sustained, becomes a chronic disruptive factor for their nervous system. You do nothing, yet your non-participation forces every one of their defensive mechanisms to keep running. And any biological system that operates under prolonged stress must pay a price, whether through emotional exhaustion, behavioral escalation, or the pursuit of increasingly lower quality sources of stimulation. Here, one practical point must be stated clearly, without romanticizing it. This process does not mean you will defeat them in the ordinary sense, nor does it mean they will realize their wrongdoing and return to apologize. What it truly represents is a structural separation, when you no longer react, no longer regulate emotions for them. You withdraw yourself from the nervous system structure that once allowed them to sustain the illusion of power. And once that structure loses its anchor, every subsequent behavior of theirs, whether it appears aggressive or silent, is merely an attempt to patch a structure that has already cracked from within. Therefore, the most important thing you need to understand at this stage is not what they will do next, but why you no longer need to participate. Your calm is not a reverse manipulation tactic. It is a sign that your nervous system has exited the old loop. You are no longer pulled into someone else's survival rhythm. And that is why, at the deepest level, your silence and non-reaction are not punishment, but the ending of a role, the ending of being a regulator for a system that lacks the capacity to self-regulate. And once that role ends, every reaction of theirs, whether intense or quiet, no longer has anything to do with you. It only reflects their own struggle with their internal structure. After the defensive restructuring phase, when smearing, avoidance, or cutting off is no longer enough to soothe the feeling of helplessness, the narcissist's nervous system enters another state that is more dangerous, but also more decisive: the collapse of the old dopamine loop. At this point, the issue is no longer the story they tell about you, but the fact that their body no longer receives the biological reward that once sustained a sense of aliveness and power. Dopamine is not the happiness chemical, as many people mistakenly believe, but the chemical of expectation, of motivation, of the feeling I am moving forward. In the prior relationship, their brain learned very clearly that emotional reactions from you, whether love, anger, pain, or argument, produce dopamine. When you withdraw from this loop for long enough, the brain does not merely feel disappointed. It begins to fall into a chronic deficit state. At the neural level, this is when the reward circuitry confronts what science calls reward prediction collapse. The brain still predicts a reward, but the reward does not arrive. And when this mismatch persists, the system can no longer sustain motivation anchored to the old target. What matters to understand is that at this stage, they are no longer obsessed with you in the ordinary emotional sense. What is happening is a kind of biological crisis. The brain needs dopamine to run the feeling that the self has value, and when the old source no longer works, it is forced to find a new source. This is not a moral choice, nor a mature decision, but the reflex of a nervous system that lacks the capacity to generate reward from within. Research on motivation and reward systems, especially the work of Kent Berridge, shows that dopamine is not tightly bound to liking, but to wanting. A person may no longer truly like an object, yet still be strongly driven by the memory of the reward once received from it. When the loop with you collapses completely, the narcissist's brain no longer wants you in a personal way, but loses the sense that there is anything to want. This state is often experienced as emptiness, restlessness, boredom, or a hard-to-name agitation. And for a psychological structure dependent on external stimulation, this emptiness is intolerable. This is precisely where the behavior of seeking a new supply appears not as a victory or progress, but as an emergency measure for the nervous system. The new person does not need to fit, does not need to be deep, and may not even need to be attractive by long-term standards. What they need is a new signal, a new reaction, a new attention source fast enough to reactivate dopamine. This is why later relationships often move at very high speed, high intensity, but with a thin foundation. The brain is not seeking connection, it is seeking stimulation. And in a dopamine deficit state, speed becomes more important than quality. A key point must be distinguished clearly. Seeking new supply does not mean the old loop has been replaced. At the neural level, The brain does not simply delete an old circuit and install a new one. The dopamine circuits associated with you have been dampened because the reward is gone, but they do not disappear completely. They become silent, and that silence can sometimes be what the brain finds most uncomfortable. Therefore, new supply is not a copy of you, but a temporary stimulation source that helps the brain avoid facing the emptiness that appears when the old circuit no longer functions. This is why many people observe that after the initial excitement, the narcissist's new relationships quickly lose heat and irritability, boredom, or a need to escalate stimulation emerges. From a social psychological perspective, this aligns with the research of Roy Baumeister, who argues that when the self is not reinforced from within, the individual will seek external validation more and more frequently, in ways that are less stable. Each time dopamine is triggered quickly without inner stability, the brain learns that it needs a stronger dose to reach the same feeling. The result is a spiral: fast new supply, high intensity, then disappointment, then searching for another source. This is not a sign of strength, but the expression of a reward system that has lost its capacity to self-adjust. What matters, and again what many people misunderstand, is that this process does not help them forget you in a deep sense. At the biological level, they do not remember you because you are you, but because you were once a stable reward circuit. When new supply is no longer sufficient to keep dopamine at the desired level, the brain may reactivate old memories as a form of comparison, not to return, but to understand why the earlier reward once worked better. This is the basis of behaviors such as distant monitoring, covert curiosity, or late, unclear approaches. Not because feelings rise again, but because the reward system still has not found a new anchor strong enough. On your side, what must be recognized clearly is that the appearance of new supply is not proof that you lost or were replaced. It is a sign that the old dopamine loop has collapsed, and their nervous system is operating in survival mode. You do not need to compare, you do not need to prove anything, and you do not need to explain. Your refusal to participate in any new loop is precisely what prevents the old circuit from being reactivated. And once the brain can no longer extract reward from you, your role in that system has truly ended. After the old dopamine loop collapses completely and they are forced to seek new supply to maintain the minimal operating state of the nervous system, many people mistakenly assume the story is over, that a new person will help them forget you and continue with life. But in psychological reality, especially in narcissistic structures that rely heavily on external regulation, your sustained calm does not bring them relief at all. On the contrary, it becomes a quiet, persistent, and far harder to handle haunting than open conflict. The reason is this: the human nervous system can become accustomed to pain, but it has great difficulty adapting to being rendered ineffective. At the biological level, when you do not react for a long time, their brain loses a familiar anchor for evaluating its own position. Before, whether positive or negative, each response from you provided data to the limbic system. I still affect them. I still exist in the other person's emotional world. When your calm persists, the brain receives neither confirmation nor resistance signals. For the survival system, this is a dangerous ambiguity, because it does not allow a clear classification as safe or threatening. The amygdala is especially sensitive to this kind of ambiguity. It cannot close the file without a conclusion. The result is a prolonged background vigilance, not intense enough to explode, but simmering enough to create continuous discomfort. The key difference lies between being hated and becoming ineffective. Being hated is still a form of recognition within the social nervous system. Being resisted still confirms influence. But sustained calm, especially when you continue living in a stable way, without proving anything, without returning to close things nicely, places them in a different position. The position of an element no longer necessary within your system. At the level of depth psychology, this strikes directly at the most primitive fear of the narcissistic structure, being removed from the central role. From Carl Jung's perspective, the ego not only needs to exist, it needs to be reflected in order to maintain the feeling of being real. Without reflection, the persona cannot keep operating smoothly, and the shadow does not have enough energy to replace it long term. But what is more important, and often overlooked, is that your calm does not create an event for them to process. There is no climax, no conflict, no clearly defined ending. This prevents their mind from closing the story at the symbolic level. The human brain is very good at processing clear shocks, but poorly adapted to long, unresolved, empty spaces. At the level of cognitive neuroscience, your calm creates a prolonged prediction error. Before, they predicted that if they could not defeat you, you would at least react with hurt, sadness, or a need for closure. But you do not. This mismatch forces the brain to keep updating new hypotheses about you, about themselves, and about the old relationship. Yet because there is no new data from you, every hypothesis is undersupported. This is the foundation of ambiguous obsession. Not missing you, not loving you, but being unable to complete a cognitive model. A key study by Leon Festinger shows that when people cannot reconcile the contradiction between belief and reality, they tend to change interpretation rather than change the core belief. In this case, the narcissist's core belief is, I have influence, I am central, I determine the emotional rhythm of others. The reality your calm brings is, you live on without needing them. This contradiction is not easily resolved by new supply, because new supply provides stimulation, but does not explain why you, someone once highly responsive to them, have become so neutral. The result is a form of cognitive obsession. They do not think about you because they want to return, but because the brain has not found a way to rationalize that you no longer need them. At a deeper biological level, your sustained calm also disrupts a mechanism many narcissistic structures use for self-soothing: comparison. When you do not react, do not display pain, and do not show collapse, they have no data to convince themselves that they won or moved on better. New supply may provide short-term dopamine, but it does not provide a clear comparison with you because you are not in a losing position. This creates an underlying instability. If you did not collapse, the story they tell about themselves loses an essential pillar. It must be emphasized that this obsession does not necessarily show outwardly. It may exist as distant curiosity, unasked questions, or moments of restlessness with no clear cause. But however it appears, it comes from the same point. Their nervous system cannot close the loop with an object that exited the game without leaving conflict behind. And unlike pain, this kind of obsession has no climax for release. It persists as background noise, simmering and repeating whenever the new reward system is no longer strong enough. On your side, understanding this is not for feeling power or satisfaction, but for stopping the wrong questions. Your calm is not a tactic designed to make them suffer. It is the natural result of your withdrawal from their regulation mechanism. If it becomes haunting, it is not because you did anything extra, but because you did nothing. And in psychology, doing nothing can sometimes be the strongest action because it provides no data for the old system to keep operating. After everything that has been analyzed, the most important question is no longer what they think or what they will do, but when will the obsession caused by your calm dissolve on its own? And when might it risk transforming into more distorted behaviors? The answer lies not in how important you once were to them, but in their nervous system's capacity for self-regulation and the structure of their ego. For individuals with mild or moderate narcissism, the obsession often decreases over time as new dopamine loops gradually stabilize, as the nervous system learns another way to function, even if imperfectly. In these cases, your calm is no longer a strongly triggering variable. It becomes an old datum, no longer powerful enough to dominate the system. The brain, however reluctantly, can still adapt when there are sufficient alternative stimulation sources and when internal conflict is not too deep. However, for severe narcissistic structures, especially those who depend almost entirely on external regulation to maintain a sense of existence, the obsession does not dissolve naturally in the same way. When the new reward system repeatedly fails, when new supply is no longer sufficient to cover the void, and when your calm continues to exist as an unresolved system error, the brain may shift from passive obsession into more active strategies. This is when behaviors such as surveillance, indirect intrusion, remote control attempts, or reapproach in a new form can appear. Not because feelings revive, but because the nervous system is desperately trying to find a way to close an unclosed loop. At the biological level, this is a coercive attempt to generate a reaction strong enough to end the prolonged ambiguity the brain cannot tolerate. It must be stated directly, without avoidance. Not all obsession is harmless. When the nervous system lacks the capacity to self-regulate, and when social mechanisms are not sufficient to prevent boundary violations, obsession can slide into dangerous territory. This is why, in clinical psychology, calm and non-reaction must always be paired with clear boundaries and practical protection when necessary. Silence is not an invitation, but for a severely dysregulated nervous system, it can be misread as a challenge. This does not weaken the value of calm. It underscores that psychological understanding must always be accompanied by practical realism. From Carl Jung's perspective, this is the split point between two paths. In some people, the loss of reflection forces them to face the shadow and gradually restructure the ego, painfully. In others, the shadow is not integrated, but pushed outward through behavior, leading to repetition that becomes increasingly depleted and dangerous. You cannot control which path they take, and you have no responsibility to keep them stable. Your only responsibility is to recognize when your calm has completed its psychological function and when you need to shift toward prioritizing safety and clearer distance. The most important conclusion of this entire sequence of analysis does not lie in them, but in you. When your calm lasts long enough that it is no longer defined by another person's reactions, it stops being an oppositional stance and becomes a foundation. You are no longer silent to prove anything, no longer calm to win against someone. You are calm because your nervous system has withdrawn from an unhealthy loop and has learned to self-regulate. And when that happens, whether their obsession dissolves or escalates, it no longer holds the central place in your inner life. The entire journey we have just moved through is not meant to answer the question of what the narcissist thinks, feels, or will do next, because that was never the center of the issue. What matters far more is understanding why your silence and calm carry such disruptive force at the level of the nervous system and the psyche, and why, once you have withdrawn from this loop, the story has truly ended, whether or not they remain fixated. At the deepest level, the narcissist does not collapse because they lost you. They collapse because they lost the ego regulation mechanism that once operated through you. When there is no longer reaction, no longer conflict, no longer a role to perform, their nervous system is forced to face what they previously avoided: the inner void and the inability to stabilize themselves from within. According to Carl Jung, individuation does not occur when other people change, but when an individual stops living through the reflection of others. For you, calm is not a strategy. It is a sign that you have withdrawn yourself from a structure that is no longer compatible with your nervous system and inner life. For them, that calm becomes a prolonged disruptive factor because it provides no data to continue manipulation and creates no climax through which to end the narrative. But this does not give you power over them. It gives you something else more important: the right to no longer be pulled in. The key point to remember is this: if your calm makes them fixated, it is not because you do anything extra, but because you no longer do anything at all. You no longer regulate their emotions. You no longer play a role in their reward system. You are no longer a variable their brain can use to restore a sense of control. And once that happens, every reaction that follows, whether seeking new supply, smearing, avoiding, or reaching out again, no longer says anything about you. It only reflects the level of instability in their inner structure. This conclusion is not meant to promise that everything will be gentle, or that they will disappear from your mind immediately. It only affirms a foundational truth. A loop exists only when there are two participants. When you withdraw from the loop at the nervous system level, not through hatred, but through sustained calm, the loop no longer has fuel to continue. Whether the other side still spins inside it or not, you are no longer in it. And that is the real ending of this story. Not in what happens to them, but in the fact that you have returned to the center of your own psychological life. When you no longer need reaction in order to exist, no longer need explanation in order to be understood, and no longer need closure in order to feel at peace, then whether their fixation dissolves or persists, it is no longer your problem. At that point, calm is no longer an oppositional state, but a foundation. And once the foundation has changed, no behavior from the other side is strong enough to pull you back into a loop that has already ended.